Brethren, do you have that kind of love? You weren't born with it. You may have a little of it through the Holy Spirit, but remember that even when we start out and receive the Holy Spirit, we don't have it to the extent that Jesus did. He had it without measure. We get it in a certain small measure, and we haven't got it fully. We're still filled with carnal love to a great extent, every one of us. That's why we overcome. As you overcome and get certain sin out, it's like getting a certain amount of air out of a bottle and putting some good pure water in. But the same amount of air has to go out. And as you get some of God's righteousness in, a certain amount of Satan's sin has to go out of you. So it works both ways. You have to get rid of Satan's way and grow in God's way. Now, God's way is the way of giving, of serving, of cooperating, of helping, of loving others, of obedience to God, and it's the way that leads to harmony and to peace. Satan's way now is every man for himself. Now, God's purpose, I went into that last night. I'd like to get into it again for just a minute. Let me see in Romans, the 8th chapter of Romans. Let me just explain part of that once again. And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are the called according to his purpose. Now, God has a purpose, and we who are Christians were called. Otherwise, Jesus said no man could come to him. Now, the only way to get back to God is through Christ. He's the only door that you can, through whom and through which you can come to God, and your sin is against God. And until you get back to God and he forgives you, the penalty hangs over you, which is death. And you can't be ransomed out of it. But Jesus said no man could come to him unless God the Father has selected you, chosen you, and has drawn you by his Spirit. And I noticed that. I notice that some people, they don't understand why themselves, but they are just being drawn by the Holy Spirit toward God. For whom he did foreknow, whom God foreknew before you were born, he also did predestinate, not to already be saved or lost before they were born, but to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he, the Son, or Jesus, might be the firstborn of many brethren. Now, I went into that last night, and in the 4th verse of the 1st chapter of Romans, you find that Jesus was made a Son of God after he'd been here as a human being on the earth. He then became a Son of God by a resurrection from the dead. He was born a Son of God by a resurrection. Now here it says he was the firstborn of us, of many brethren, and we can be born as he was. But how was he born? By a resurrection, and changed from mortal to immortal, changed from matter composed of the ground of the earth, and having to breathe air, which is part of the earth in a gaseous form, to stay alive. He was changed to immortality. And that's the way we will be born again. And these so-called born-again Christians don't know what they are talking about, brethren. I pray that they will sometime have their minds opened to come to understand the truth of God. But they only preach about Christ, and it's a false Christ that they're preaching, not the true Christ. They don't even know the true Christ. That's one of the curses on the world. And look at this world. They think it's God's world. Oh, it is not. It is Satan's world. Satan was placed on that throne and to administer government. Now, he deserted the government of God and turned to his own kind of government. Government is a way of life, and his way of life is hostility against God. His way of life is selfishness and vanity, and every man for himself. All right? Now, what is the purpose of God? Is to create man and to reproduce himself through human beings. He made us out of the dirt of the ground. Let's see, the Bible of the Arab world, now wait a minute, the name, I had it right on my tongue, it won't come out. Quran. It says he was made out of mud. Well, whether it was mud or just dirt, dirt is just dry mud, but the water's gone out of it. Either way, man was made of the dirt of the ground. Now, Jesus plainly said, he that is born of the flesh is flesh. That is still matter. He that is born of the Spirit is spirit. He becomes spirit, no longer matter. Why can't the preachers of this world see that? They can't. They're blinded. And Satan has blinded them. You read that in 2 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, is it 2:4 or 4? 3 and 4, I think it is. Well, now, back in Genesis, the first chapter, in the beginning, God, which is Elohim, and that is a plural name, means more than one, and it meant God and the Word, created the heavens and the earth. And God created all things by Jesus Christ, as you read in Ephesians 3 and verse 9. But he formed man of the dust of the ground and made man only to have a temporary, physical, chemical existence. You're like a clock running down, and it was wound up, and when it runs down, there's nothing but just winding it up while it dies. It isn't running any longer. But now God is going to reproduce himself in man, and to do that, man has to come to have God's character. And God's character is choosing God's way of life through any kind of temptation and going that way and setting himself to live the way of God's life, the way of love, friendship, cooperation, and obedience to God and worship of God. That is the way. And until you have chosen that way and have set yourself and have overcome every other way, you finally will be made God like he was. And in 1 John, the 3rd chapter, in verse 9, you read that once we are born of God, we cannot sin. We won't be able to sin. It'll be impossible to sin, just as it's impossible for Christ to sin. It's impossible for God to sin. It was not impossible for Christ to sin when he was human on earth. Oh no, he was tempted in all points like we are. But now he's been made God once again. By a resurrection, it will be impossible for Christ to sin now, and impossible for God, because they have so set themselves they won't. And being spirit, spirit never changes. As Jesus said, he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. God says, I change not. And when we become God, we will never change. And we have got to set ourselves in God's way in this life before we can be born of him. Now, first Adam had a choice if he was to become the character of God, and that character had to come from God, but it had to come by Adam's choice. It would have been, if God had just forced it on him, it wouldn't have been character. Character means it was his own choice. Well, life was offered to him in the tree of life. Everything in that Garden of Eden was offered to Adam but one tree, and God said, don't touch it. Brethren, Satan got to them. And look, he gets even to babies. Before they're 9 months old, Satan has already got to them and put selfishness in them. Put a little baby 9 months old who can't walk yet, and set him down on the floor, and put about 8 or 10 toys or a dozen or something on the floor, but point to one, just one toy, and say, no, look, can't touch, no touch. Can't play with that, just play with the others. But don't touch that one now. Don't touch it. And you go out and close the door. Just peek through the keyhole, and he doesn't know you're watching. And you watch him.